Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping right into the absolute most devastating conflict in human history. We're going to unpack exactly how and why World War II actually happened. Because, this wasn't just some sudden explosion out of nowhere. It was a perfect storm. We're going to explore this massive collision of economic ruin, political extremism, and incredibly rapid military innovation that literally set the entire globe on fire.
4,000 degrees Celsius. Just let that sink in for a second. In August 1945, the atomic bombs dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki generated these unimaginably terrifying temperatures. We're talking about a blast so intensely bright that it could be seen over 100 miles away. It caused over 129,000 immediate casualties and forced Japan's surrender just days later. It was the devastating, unprecedented climax of an absolute global nightmare.
But to really wrap our heads around this global catastrophe, we have to hit the rewind button. How did humanity even reach this point? How did a single treaty from a previous war manage to ignite this worldwide fire, taking us all the way from the end of the First World War to the actual deployment of nuclear weapons in the Second? Part 1. The Seeds of Another War.
It's crazy to think about, but the seeds for this Second Global War were actually planted the literal second the first one ended. The Treaty of Versailles had this specific provision called Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Basically, it slapped Germany with a crippling $33 billion fine. That's something like $270 billion in today's money. And on top of that staggering debt, Germany was totally stripped of its military and its territory. Now, this was intended to prevent future wars, but by completely crushing a nation's economy and their pride, it did the exact opposite.
Since Germany just couldn't even come close to paying off those staggering debts, the government got desperate. Their solution? Just print more money. And obviously, that backfired spectacularly. By 1923, hyperinflation spiraled so far out of control that a single loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. I mean, imagine a currency becoming so utterly worthless that kids are literally out in the street playing with stacks of cash like toy blocks, all while ordinary citizens are starving.
And just when you think it couldn't get worse, boom, the global Great Depression hits in 1929. Suddenly, unemployment in Germany skyrockets to a staggering 6 million people. So you have a population that's destitute, humiliated, and desperate for someone, anyone to blame. That environment right there, that is the absolute perfect breeding ground for radicalism. Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party capitalized on this exact desperation, manipulating a broken public by promising to just tear up the Treaty of Versailles and restore Germany to its former dominance.
So as this really aggressive militarism surged in Germany, and we're seeing the same thing happen in Italy under Mussolini and in Imperial Japan, the globe began to violently fracture. The world essentially locked itself into two massive, totally opposed alliances. You've got the Allies on one side and the Axis powers on the other. This rigid, zero-sum division basically guaranteed that if even one little spark went off, the entire world was going to catch fire.
Part 2. The Lightning War. Look at how fast this timeline moves. Between 1936 and 1939, Hitler is aggressively testing his boundaries. He annexes the Rhineland, absorbs Austria, and takes over Czechoslovakia. And for years, the international community largely just watches in silence, hoping that giving in, appeasement, would avoid another bloodbath. But then comes September 1939. The invasion of Poland was the breaking point. Appeasement had completely failed, and Britain and France were finally forced to declare war.
Now here's the thing. The Allies were essentially geared up to fight World War I again. But Germany, they unleashed something completely terrifying and brand new called Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Gone are the days of static, muddy trench warfare. Instead, Germany is using incredibly rapid, concentrated tank movements paired with deafening, coordinated airstrikes to create absolute psychological shock. They completely overwhelmed their opponent's command structures before a defense could even be organized.
Okay, this detail is absolutely mind-blowing. How on earth did they maintain that relentless pace? Well, German troops were actually issued a drug called Pervitin. And what was it? It was essentially crystal meth. This unbelievably powerful stimulant suppressed the soldiers' need for sleep and food, giving the German army this terrifying, almost unnatural speed. They were fighting day and night without stopping, completely catching their exhausted enemies off guard.
Because of that blinding speed, the Germans pulled off a maneuver everyone thought was geographically impossible. France had built these massive, static defenses known as the Maginot Line. So what do the Germans do? They don't attack it. They just drive thousands of tanks right around it, straight through the Ardennes forest, which the French thought was completely impenetrable. In a flash, hundreds of thousands of Allied troops are outflanked and trapped against the sea at Dunkirk. They only survived because a desperate fleet of everyday civilian fishing and pleasure boats literally sailed straight into a war zone to rescue them.
France ended up falling in just a matter of weeks. So facing this terrifying Axis momentum, Britain is sitting there largely all alone. In what was an incredibly dark hour, Prime Minister Winston Churchill rallies his battered nation with those famous defiant words, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." And you know what? They didn't. During the grueling aerial combat of the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force miraculously held off the German Luftwaffe, proving to the entire world that Hitler's machine could, in fact, bleed.
Part 3. The conflict goes global.
In 1941, everything changes. The scope of the war explodes outward, mainly due to two massive, historically fatal strategic gambles. First, fueled by total hubris, Hitler breaks his non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin and actually invades the Soviet Union. This opens up a brutal Eastern Front that eventually swallows millions of German soldiers in the freezing Russian winter. Then, just months later, Japan launches a devastating surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Instantly, the massive industrial might of the United States gets dragged right into the fray.
And because this conflict was now spanning multiple continents, it was draining massive amounts of resources from colonies that were entirely disconnected from the original European dispute. India, which was under British rule at the time, saw 2.5 million of its soldiers pulled into the fight. Worse still, the massive diversion of grain and logistics to feed those fighting armies triggered catastrophic civilian tragedies. The most heartbreaking is the 1943 famine in Bengal, where an estimated 3 million innocent people starved to death. This wasn't just a European war, it was a truly global tragedy.
Part 4. The final surrender.
Eventually, the Axis powers were just totally overextended, fighting on way too many fronts and entirely outmatched by the combined industrial production of America and the immense manpower of the Soviets. Their collapse was inevitable. Crushed right between the Western Allies advancing from France and a brutal Soviet offensive pushing from the east, the German military machine was completely dismantled. As Berlin finally fell, Hitler committed suicide, leading to Germany's surrender in May 1945. But the war wasn't actually over. Out in the Pacific, Japan stubbornly refused to yield.
Part 5. A Reshaped World. Bringing us full circle back to that terrifying atomic conclusion we talked about at the very beginning, Japan's surrender finally ends the fighting. But when we break down the human cost, it is genuinely sickening. An estimated 60 to 80 million people died worldwide. This is what historians call a total war, meaning the lines between soldier and citizen were completely erased. Cities, factories, regular neighborhoods, they were all considered legitimate military targets. And because of that, of the tens of millions killed, a staggering 67% were innocent civilians.
Literally out of the ashes of this unparalleled destruction, the modern world as we know it today was born. In a desperate global attempt to prevent the Third World War from ever happening, the United Nations was formed. But the geopolitical landscape immediately fractured all over again, sparking the Cold War between two brand new superpowers, the USA and the USSR. Meanwhile, the old European empires were so financially and militarily wiped out that they couldn't hold on to their territories anymore, sparking mass decolonization and independence movements all across Asia and Africa.
So, as we wrap up this explainer and reflect on the absolute incredible scale and devastation of World War II, we really have to pause and ask ourselves, what is the true cost of global conflict? As time distances us from these events and the generation that actually fought it passes on, just how fragile is our lasting peace? Have we truly learned the lessons of humanity's darkest hour? Thank you so much for watching, and keep asking those big questions.